This is the second of two videos in which I talk through the Year 11 Study of Religion Task 2, which is a multimodal presentation based on an ethnographic investigation. In the first video, I talk briefly about what ethnography actually is, so that you'll have some idea of what it is that you're expected to participate in as you complete this task. In this video, I want to talk through the scaffold which you have been given, which you will find under Class Resources on the Ultimate Questions Origins Life page. And it would be very useful if you had the scaffold in front of you as you watch this video. On the first page of the scaffold, I've created a table for you to organise your time. In Year 11 and 12, time management becomes a very, very important issue. And if you're not careful, especially with a complicated research task such as this one, it's very easy to not leave yourself enough time at the end of the term to finish the task to a satisfactory standard. So I'd encourage you to look at the table on the first page, think about what other commitments you have over the coming weeks, and then come up with a schedule for how you plan to bring this particular task to its completion. On the second page of the scaffold, you'll find the task which comes from the task sheet. And what we've done on the scaffold is that we've highlighted the important things that the question is asking. One of the things you should always do with a question is to go through and highlight what we call the top level structure of the question, because this will give you an indication of what it is that the teacher is looking for. The other thing you should also look at very carefully is the criteria sheet, because the criteria sheet tells you very, very clearly what it is that you're actually being marked on. And then when you've completed the task, it's a good idea to go back to that criteria sheet and make sure that you have actually satisfied the requirements of the task. So when we look at the key points from the task, the things you'll notice, and these have been highlighted in yellow, are as follows. It's a multimodal presentation. That means essentially at Year 11 and 12 level, we want you to create a documentary segment about the topic that you're going to investigate. And the topic in this case is creation stories. They might be Aboriginal creation stories or they might be Jewish creation stories. So you're to look at either of those types of stories. What you're interested in finding out is what has been the impact of science on how believers of those two traditions understand their creation stories. And that's what you're looking to do in your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is a statement of what you're planning on arguing. And what you need to do in your hypothesis is connect the 2 points. So it might be something like, I will argue that science, whilst it has had an impact on the lifestyle of Jewish believers, has not really affected how they understand their creation stories. But the hypothesis needs to connect the 2 aspects of the task. It's very, very important, and that should be stated very clearly early on in your presentation. With an ethnographic investigation, there are a number of parts. If you're going to be talking to someone who is either an Aboriginal or a Jewish person, you need to do a lot of background research so that you can talk to them in an intelligent way about the creation stories of their particular tradition. And so to that end, you need to find as many documents as you can that tell you about the creation stories of those people. And that's the first part of the task. At this stage, I'd recommend that you have a look at both Aboriginal and Jewish creation stories, because it might be that something that you didn't realise about one of those stories is actually very interesting and you'd like to follow it up in more detail. So by not restricting what you're going to do early in the investigation, you keep an open mind on what it is that you might decide to investigate. Once you've had a bit of a look at both, it's then time to start deciding which one you are going to specialise in. And this year, at this stage, you should have a PowerPoint that you've completed on the story that science tells about the beginnings of the universe, and you should have a PowerPoint on what Aboriginal people understand happened in terms of the creation of the world. On the Life Ultimate Questions page, you'll also find a PowerPoint on Judaism, which will be useful in terms of providing background information for Jewish creation stories. The Life page also has some short video clips about how Jewish and Aboriginal people understand their creation stories, and I'd recommend that you look at those too. So what you need to do early in the investigation is come up with what we call framing questions. Framing questions are questions that any ordinary person might have about a particular topic. They don't have to be very sophisticated. They're simply questions that get your investigation going. And so the scaffold asks you to list some of those questions. There are three things in the Study of Religion course that you need to consider here. First is what we call Australian religious perspectives. So it would be useful to know how many Aboriginal and Jewish people are there in Australia. The other thing that we look at in Study of Religion is world religions. So as we look between these two traditions, the Aboriginal and the Jewish tradition, do we find similarities in terms of how they understand their creation story or even the story that they tell? And finally, the third area of interest in Study of Religion is what we call the nature and significance of religion. And that's where the ongoing significance of these stories becomes quite important. So as you think about your framing questions, think about those three key aspects. You then move into the phase of the investigation where you gather your data. So you're looking here for as much information as you can find. Especially in terms of Aboriginal stories, it's important to be aware of the diversity of those stories. If you're looking at Jewish creation stories, you need to also be aware there are two of those stories that you will find in the Torah, and you need to understand how those stories were written and how they were later edited and how they found their way into the Torah. So that's a very, very important part of the task. So once you've done your reading and you've looked at the creation stories and you've looked at what people might be saying about them, you're then in a position to come up with an initial hypothesis. What it is initially that you're wanting to test when you're talking to either an Aboriginal or a Jewish person about the impact of science on how they understand their creation story. Now, the hypothesis can change. You need to be open as you go through the investigation that things might not be what you think, and new pieces of evidence means that the hypothesis might need to be modified or in some cases changed completely. So it's very, very important to do that. The other thing which is very, very important is for you to be very, very clear that you understand what your own preconceptions about a particular religion might be. We live in a very secular society where religious belief is not something which comes naturally to many people. And especially when we talk about ancient stories, ancient creation stories in traditions such as the ones we're looking at, it can be quite tempting for people to be very dismissive of those stories and to think that the story science tells is the only story. So we need to be very, very clear about what our own prejudices might be as we approach this task. And it's useful to write those down, and there's space on the scaffold for you to do that. So once you've done that and once you have undergone your preliminary research, it's then possible to begin talking to either an Aboriginal or a Jewish believer about their stories. And when you do that, it's very, very important that you're sensitive to the tradition. So with Jewish people in particular, Jewish people do not mention the name of their God. They will talk about God, but they will not name their God. So out of respect, when we talk to Jewish people, we don't use the name either. And that's a very, very important and culturally sensitive thing to do. In fact, with this task, cultural sensitivity is very, very important, especially when you get to the final phases of presenting your documentary segment. So a good way to open the interview is by asking the person to just tell you a little bit about themselves. Where are they from? If they're an Aboriginal person, what tribe do they belong to? If they're a Jewish person, what strand within Judaism do they belong to? So that you can begin situating where they are. And it's important to understand the diversity that there is within each of those traditions. So after the person has told you a little bit about themselves, you might then have some specific questions that you can ask. It's good to have a list of questions, but it's also good to be listening very attentively to the person, because it might well be that in some of the things they say, they take your investigation in a way that you hadn't thought. So be prepared to think on your feet. Have some questions there, but also be prepared to change those questions if the conversation goes in a different way. After you've talked to the person, you then need to sit down fairly soon after the interview and look at the data that you've collected. So you need to write down what you've heard as much as you can and as much detail as you can. It's not a good idea to do that while you're actually talking to the person, because that can give the impression that you're not really listening very attentively to what they're trying to tell you. But as soon as the interview's finished, write down in as much detail as you can the information that you've gained. For that reason, it's sometimes not a bad idea if 2 or 3 people talk to the same person, because then you can pool your notes and put those together. So once you've done that, it then becomes possible to begin organising your data. It might well be that there are some other questions that you need to go and find out. And this might require a follow-up interview with someone, or it might be something that you can find out by going to the internet. In most cases, you will be able to find the information you need on the internet. But look for the answers to those questions. And once you've completed your research, it's then time to begin thinking about how exactly you're going to put your documentary together. And you've got some things you need to think about there. Remember, you're a storyteller. You are telling people who are watching your documentary segment a story about the impact of science on Jewish or Aboriginal belief in creation stories. So tell a story. Stories need to have an introduction, they need to have a middle, and they need to have an end. So as you begin developing your script, think about that very carefully, and make sure in your introduction you say very clearly what it is that you're planning on arguing throughout the presentation. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the steps that you need to take in order to complete this particular task. I will do a third video in which we'll talk in more detail about the decisions that you might need to make as you make your multimodal presentation and you finalise the different components of it.